Have you heard of the terrible massacre at Nob? Believe it, this story will shock you. This story is a real example of what happens when someone turns away from God. Most people believe they know the most impactful stories from the Bible, but the truth is that we often overlook details that can change everything. If you think you've heard it all about the massacre at Nob, get ready to be surprised. What you think you know is just the surface of a shocking story that reveals deep secrets about faith, betrayal, and devastating consequences. In this video, I'll show you hidden revelations in 1 Samuel 22 that could not only transform your understanding of this passage, but also offer powerful insights for your own life. If you stay with me until the end, you'll hear truths that could change the way you see the trials you face, and even more importantly, transform your life in ways you never imagined. Are you interested? Then comment now, "Lord, thank you because I am closer to you." Just comment that, "Lord, thank you because I am closer to you." When I see your comment, I'll give it a heart because I know you'll receive these blessings soon. And today, the Lord will envelop you with His infinite grace and mercy. Now that you've commented, let's continue. The setting of the massacre at Nob is one of the most turbulent in the Bible, marked by a leadership crisis and deep divisions. Saul, the first king of Israel, had begun his reign with great promise and divine anointing. However, disobedience and drifting away from God's will began to erode his authority and sanity. As his failures accumulated, Saul found himself increasingly enmeshed in paranoia and anger, creating an atmosphere of palpable tension throughout the kingdom. He no longer saw David as an ally, but as an existential threat that needed to be eradicated at any cost. David, a young shepherd anointed by God to succeed Saul, became the main target of the king's wrath. What started as a mentor-protege relationship quickly turned into a relentless hunt. David's military victories and growing popular support put him on a collision course with the king, who feared losing his throne and influence. Instead of viewing David as a possible successor within divine plans, Saul saw him as a direct threat to his power, fueling a cycle of distrust and fear that permeated his rule. This atmosphere of distrust and fear was intensified by betrayal and intrigue within the kingdom. The environment became so volatile that even the priests of Nob, a group traditionally serving as the spiritual guardians of Israel, came to be viewed with suspicion. Saul, already consumed by paranoia, began to believe that anyone associated with David was conspiring against him. This mentality created an atmosphere where loyalty was constantly questioned, and anyone with ties to David became a potential target. The massacre at Nob did not occur in a vacuum. It was the climax of a period of rising instability and fear. Saul's decision to order the execution of the priests and their families was not an isolated act, but a culmination of a series of desperate and destructive choices. The city of Nob, with its essential role as a religious center, was chosen as a brutal example to send a message of terror to anyone who dared to challenge him or even sympathize with David. This decision was Saul's attempt to reaffirm his control through brute force, but it only demonstrated the depth of his moral and spiritual decay. You might wonder how such a promising leadership could have fallen so low. The answer lies in Saul's inability to recognize and correct his mistakes and the growing distance between him and God. This disconnect not only exacerbated his paranoia, but also isolated him from any divine guidance. As Saul sank further into disobedience and distrust, he transformed his kingdom into a place of fear and violence, setting the stage for a massacre that would shock everyone and leave an indelible scar on Israel's history. The city of Nob was not just an ordinary place in Israel. It was a spiritual bastion, a center of worship and connection with God. As the headquarters of the tabernacle, Nob was where people gathered to seek divine guidance, offer sacrifices, and keep the religious tradition alive. This city served as a beacon of hope and devotion for the Israelites, being crucial for maintaining the faith and spiritual identity of the nation. Imagine Nob as the beating heart of Israel's religious life, where every prayer and sacrifice was a direct bridge between the people and the Lord. The priests of Nob had a crucial role in this scenario, as they were the intermediaries between God and the people. They were not only responsible for rituals and sacrifices, but also for spiritual instruction and the preservation of divine laws and teachings. These priests, led by Abiathar, were seen as pillars of justice and religious purity. They helped maintain the spiritual and moral order of the people, offering not only practical guidelines, but also a direct connection to the sacred. Their presence in Nob represented the continuity of the covenant between God and Israel. However, Nob's elevated status and its essential role as a spiritual center did not prevent the city from becoming a target. Nob's association with David, a fugitive from Saul's wrath, put the city in the king's crosshairs. For Saul, any place that offered refuge to David became suspicious, a potential point of betrayal. Nob, with its proximity to David and its importance as a religious center, came to be seen not only as a sanctuary for the adversary, but as a symbol of resistance to his authority. This distorted perception fueled Saul's paranoia and violence, leading to his devastating decision. You might wonder how such a sacred city could be destroyed by a king who ostensibly served God. The answer lies in the tragedy of spiritual and moral disintegration. Consumed by anger and distrust, Saul completely lost discernment and vision from God. In his mind, Nob ceased to be a sanctuary of faith and became an obstacle to his retention of power. This shift in perception made him view the priests and the city not as guardians of truth, but as enemies to be eliminated. This moral distortion brought to light the true horror of his decline. The massacre at Nob was not just an act of cruelty, but a cry of desperation and a mark of the corruption of a leader who had turned away from God. The destruction of Nob symbolizes the loss of the spiritual connection that sustained the nation and the devastation resulting from the rupture between leadership and divine morality. Ultimately, the tragedy of Nob serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of maintaining spiritual purity and true leadership, and how corruption and distancing from God can lead to unimaginable consequences for everyone around. Saul began his journey as king of Israel with great promise and divine approval. Chosen by God to lead a nation and establish a new era, he was anointed with special authority and a clear mission to unite and guide the people of Israel. Initially, Saul demonstrated humility and courage, traits that reflected God's will. However, as his reign progressed, pride began to infiltrate his heart, corrupting the purity of his leadership and his connection with the Lord. This pride, which initially seemed an advantage in his ability to govern, quickly became a destructive force that began to erode his faith and purpose. Disobedience was the first visible sign of Saul's spiritual decline. Instead of following God's precise instructions, Saul began to make decisions based on his own judgment and personal ambitions. A crucial example was his decision to spare Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and the best spoils of battle, directly disobeying the divine command to destroy everything. This act of disobedience was not just a failure to carry out an order, but a rejection of God's authority, showing a pattern of behavior that ignored divine will in favor of his own desires and interests. As Saul continued to deviate from divine orders, his connection with God became increasingly tenuous. The loss of direct communication with God made Saul a progressively irrational and unpredictable leader. The absence of divine guidance left him vulnerable to fear and paranoia, leading him to increasingly desperate and destructive decisions. This state of desperation was evidenced by his increasingly drastic actions against those he saw as threats to his power, including his former allies and even the priests of Nob. The culmination of this departure was the massacre at Nob, an act of horrendous violence that demonstrated the depth of Saul's moral fall. In his disturbed mind, the city of Nob and its priests were no longer seen as defenders of faith and morality, but as conspirators and enemies. Saul's decision to exterminate all the inhabitants of Nob was an extreme manifestation of his desperation and distorted values, a dark reflection of how pride and disobedience led him to a state of tyranny and brutality. This tragedy was a direct result of Saul's disconnection from divine guidance and the morality that once sustained him. How can you reflect on your own life? What happens when you drift away from principles and guidelines that steer our behavior and decisions? Saul's story is a powerful warning about the consequences of allowing pride and disobedience to take root in our lives. Saul's trajectory clearly shows how leadership that starts with God's blessing can quickly crumble when we ignore his guidance and allow our own desires to distort the truth. It's a call to reflect on the importance of maintaining humility and obedience so that we do not fall into the same path of destruction that led Saul to his tragic downfall. Saul, in his darkest moments, was consumed by devastating paranoia. Once anointed and blessed by God, he now saw the world through a distorted lens of fear and distrust. Saul's paranoia was not just a fleeting sensation, but an oppressive force that shaped all his actions and decisions. He convinced himself that enemies lurked around every corner, in every shadow, and this distorted view led him to question even those closest to him. His tormented mind was so immersed in distrust that anyone who had contact with David, his former protege, was seen as a threat. The priests of Nob, who should have been the pillars of Israel's morality and faith, were tragically targeted by this paranoia. Saul, who once had shown respect for these sacred figures, now saw them as conspirators and traitors. The city of Nob, a religious and worship center, turned into a hunting ground where Saul felt justified in seeking and eliminating any trace of sympathy for David. This drastic shift in Saul's perception was not just an act of betrayal against the priests, but a reflection of his spiritual disconnect and the erosion of his moral principles. Saul's paranoia serves as a striking example of what happens when someone turns away from God. Without divine guidance, Saul became an unstable leader whose view of reality was irreversibly distorted. Fear and violence began to dominate his mind, paving the way for irrational and cruel decisions. He could no longer distinguish between allies and enemies, between justice and revenge. Instead of seeking wisdom and guidance, he sank deeper into a chasm of distrust and cruelty, showing how the absence of a solid spiritual foundation can lead to chaos and destruction. Imagine the state of a mind so disturbed that it sees traitors even in the most sacred places. The massacre at Nob was not just an act of violence, it was a dark reflection of Saul's mental and spiritual degradation. This inability to see the truth and justice reveals the devastating cost of separation from God. When the connection with the divine is severed, the empty space is quickly filled with fear, doubt, and violence. Saul, once an anointed king, became a symbol of how a lack of faith and disobedience can corrupt even the most promising heart. The story of Saul is a powerful warning about the importance of maintaining our connection with God and the need to seek divine guidance in times of crisis. Saul's trajectory demonstrates how spiritual disconnection not only affects our morality and judgment, but can also lead us to a state of paranoia and destruction. From Saul's example, we can reflect on the need for a solid foundation of faith and discernment to avoid making the same mistakes and to maintain clarity and justice in our lives. Saul's order to exterminate all the priests and inhabitants of Nob is one of the darkest episodes in biblical history. Driven by a mixture of fear and hatred, Saul was convinced that any sympathy for David, his rival, was a direct threat to his power. This irrational fear and the desire to eliminate anyone associated with David culminated in a brutal decision to eradicate the city of Nob, a center of worship and justice. The city, known for its holiness and devotion, became the target of a ruthless attack, a decision that revealed the depth of Saul's corruption and desperation. The immediate impact of this order was devastating. Nob, once a place of peace and reverence, was transformed into a scene of destruction and chaos. The city was invaded, and its inhabitants, men, women, and children, were cruelly murdered. The brutality of the massacre reflected the state of moral degradation in which Saul found himself. This act of violence not only eliminated innocent lives, but also symbolized the loss of any connection to the justice and mercy that God expected from a leader of Israel. The city was reduced to rubble, and the massacre scene was a horrendous testament to the cost of paranoia and unchecked hatred. At the epicenter of this atrocity was Doeg the Edomite, who was chosen by Saul to execute the order. Doeg, who held a prominent position as chief of Saul's shepherds, became the instrument of a terrible injustice. He did not hesitate to carry out the cruel order, killing the priests and inhabitants of Nob with a zeal that reflected both his own ambition and his blind obedience to Saul's corrupt power. His involvement in the massacre not only marked him as an accomplice to a heinous crime, but also as a symbol of the corruption and brutality that can emerge when power is misused. Blind obedience to corrupt power, as exemplified by Doeg, has devastating consequences. In his quest to please and retain Saul's favor, Doeg did not question the morality or justice of the order he received. His willingness to follow orders without scruples, regardless of the atrocities involved, illustrates a grave problem: the capacity of humans to commit terrible injustices when they subordinate their personal ethics to the authority of a corrupt leader. This leads us to reflect. How far are we willing to go to follow orders from authorities who have clearly deviated from justice and morality? The massacre at Nob and Doeg's actions serve as a grim reminder that blind obedience is not a value to be admired, but a danger to be avoided. The story teaches us that when we allow corrupt power to dictate our actions without questioning, we not only permit evil to prevail, but also become complicit in it. The absence of morality and the lack of courage to question corrupt leadership can lead to disastrous consequences, as seen in the destruction of Nob and the massacre of its inhabitants. Furthermore, Doeg's trajectory serves as a warning about the danger of submitting to corrupt power. He, who could have been a defender of justice, became an executor of atrocities due to his willingness to obey without question. His story highlights the importance of maintaining integrity and the courage to confront evil, even when it means challenging powerful figures of authority. Blind obedience to power not only corrupts the individual, but can also have a devastating impact on society. The massacre at Nob, with all its implications and Doeg's role as the executor, offers a profound and impactful lesson on the importance of maintaining solid moral principles and the need for courage to question injustice. Reflecting on this dark episode, we are invited to consider how we would react in situations of corrupt power and the importance of maintaining our ethics and justice in the face of any authority. The story of Nob is a call to action to ensure that in any situation, morality and justice prevail over blind obedience and fear. Saul's departure from God and the subsequent destruction is a powerful example of the dangers of drifting away from faith. Saul, chosen by God and anointed as king, began to deviate from divine paths when pride and disobedience took over his heart. This disconnection was not just a personal change, but a catalyst for a series of destructive events. The massacre at Nob, an episode of brutality and chaos, directly resulted from Saul's spiritual departure. When we distance ourselves from God, we lose our direction, moral clarity, and eventually, our ability to make just choices. This departure from God is not a phenomenon restricted to antiquity. It resonates deeply in our modern lives. When individuals or communities stray from divine principles, we see the same loss of direction and chaos that occurred during Saul's reign. The disintegration of values, the rise in violence, and the breakdown of personal relationships are clear signs that something fundamental is missing. The massacre at Nob serves as a dark mirror for our era, reflecting how the absence of a solid moral foundation can lead to devastating consequences for both the individual and the community. Saul's personal life and the massacre at Nob show us how spiritual disconnection can unleash a cycle of despair and destruction. Without divine guidance, Saul made irrational and cruel decisions, harming those who should have been protected. In our own lives, drifting away from faith can lead to thoughtless choices, conflicts, and a general state of despair. I ask you, are there areas in your life where you feel you are drifting away from your spiritual principles? How is this affecting your behavior and decisions? The massacre at Nob also serves as a powerful reminder of divine justice in contrast to human injustice. Although Saul's cruelty and Doeg's blind obedience caused immense tragedy, the story does not end in injustice. God's justice, though it may sometimes seem delayed, prevails. Even when events seem dominated by human injustice, God is working behind the scenes to ensure that divine justice is restored and recognized. This gives us hope that, even amidst disorder and chaos, divine justice will be fulfilled. This point should lead us to reflect on our own lives. In what areas are we setting aside our faith, and how is this shaping our actions and decisions? The massacre at Nob is not just an ancient story. It is a warning to each of us about the consequences of drifting away from God. Staying faithful and seeking divine guidance can prevent the personal and social deterioration we saw in Saul's story. Remain connected to your faith and observe how this can transform your life in profound and positive ways. Moreover, the parallel between Saul's story and our modern lives calls us to consider how we can be agents of change and justice in our communities. When we align with divine principles, we not only avoid personal disasters, but also promote an environment of peace and justice around us. Saul's life is a clear warning about the dangers of disobedience and an invitation to live with integrity and unwavering faith. Although the massacre at Nob is widely known for its brutality, there are hidden details that reveal additional layers of complexity and depth. One such detail is the crucial role of Abiathar, the sole survivor of the massacre. Abiathar was one of the priests who was in Nob at the time of the tragedy. His survival was not merely a coincidence, it had a profound impact on the subsequent narratives. By fleeing, Abiathar not only escaped death, but also became a vital link between what remained of the priestly lineage and the future events in Israel. His survival and alliance with David were key to ensuring the continuity of the priesthood and shaping the future leadership of Israel. Abiathar's flight had significant implications for the biblical narrative. By seeking refuge with David, Abiathar brought with him not only the personal experience of a terrible tragedy, but also the priestly legitimacy and morality that David needed to affirm his leadership. He was not just a survivor, but a symbol of hope and justice in times of desolation. Imagine the tension and gravity of the moment when Abiathar approached David, carrying the weight of Nob and the responsibility of rebuilding what was destroyed. This act of alliance helped shape David's perception as a king who valued justice and integrity, contrasting with Saul's cruelty. Another often overlooked detail is the psychological and emotional impact of the massacre on Abiathar. How did he cope with the loss of his fellow priests and being one of the few survivors? This emotional burden not only shaped his stance towards Saul and David, but also influenced his actions and decisions in the following years. The trauma of Nob was not merely a distant event, but a deeply formative experience that affected his choices and his view of the role of the priesthood and leadership in Israel. Furthermore, the massacre at Nob and Abiathar's survival demonstrate how seemingly disconnected events can have cascading effects on history. The destruction of Nob seemed to mark the end of an era, but Abiathar's alliance with David made this dark event a crucial turning point. What seemed like a victory for Saul and his followers turned into a catalyst for change. Thus, the sacrifice of Nob was not in vain. It helped shape the future history of Israel and ensured that justice and fidelity to God were restored. It is important to reflect on the role of small nuances in historical events. The story of Abiathar and his alliance with David is a powerful reminder that seemingly minor details can have profound and lasting impacts. While we observe grand narratives and dramatic events, we must not forget that it is these small connections and individual choices that often shape the course of history. Abiathar's survival and subsequent role not only illuminated the tragedy of Nob, but also offered a perspective of hope and redemption, showing that even in the shadows of calamity, the light of justice and divine continuity can shine brightly. Never distance yourself from God. This is crucial, and I will repeat, never distance yourself from God. In times of difficulty, it is easy to feel tempted to drift away, but it is precisely in those moments that we need Him more than ever. When you distance yourself, you lose direction and open yourself up to chaos and destruction, as we saw in Saul's case and the massacre at Nob. So, once again, never distance yourself from God. His presence is what gives us strength, guidance, and peace in times of trial. Stay close to Him, seek His wisdom, and trust in His ways. Reinforcing, never distance yourself from God. On my YouTube channel, my focus is on 3 essential things: educating, inspiring, and uplifting others to draw closer to Jesus, our Lord and Savior. Here, you will find resources to deepen your understanding of the Scriptures, strengthen your faith, and transform your life. If you watched until the end, comment like this: "I stayed until the end." Just comment that. When I see your comment, I will give a heart, because I know I added value to you, and I will be even more motivated to consistently bring the highest quality content. Now, a powerful video that is a continuation of this one is appearing on your screen. It is filled with riches, secrets about God, and biblical insights that will accelerate your results in all areas of your life. Click on this video. Do it now and continue your journey of spiritual growth and learning.